every foreign firm would have sort of informal color bar. They use their own nationals in the managerial positions. Strikes, we find strikes in almost every single site we've been to. These are non-unionized workers, but the working conditions are so bad that whenever they cannot get paid, there will be strikes, spontaneous strikes. Strikes have been declared illegal unless the strike has been bureaucratically approved through the court and through union decision-making process. So basically, any strike is illegal, but we see many of them. And it's not true that only on Chinese sites do you have people who are so exploited and disgruntled that you will have strikes. Basically, everywhere we go, every single site we've been to have experienced one strike. And it's just so amazing because all you hear in the reports, even in Zambia, is that the Chinese are the worst. We always have strike there. But if you look at, once you conduct this kind of national survey and compare them, they're all the same. Now, I'll come to what is so special about it. There are some special features about these Chinese firms. But let me explain why you find this kind of appalling working conditions. It has to do with the Zambian government. And they have come out with these laws, basically legalizing casualization. You look at the labor law that was revised in 1997. It is legal to employ workers as casuals. And they bureaucratize strikes so that it's almost impossible for anybody to strike. They will have 2 weeks of cooling period. And you have to get approval from the court. And once you do that, there'll be no strike. So basically, bureaucratization of strikes. And then you have the minimum wage law, because unions are quite weak there, and the government has been pro-investors for a long time. So the minimum wage law set a very low minimum wage. So you're legally paying your workers very low salary, and it's legal. And then the Industrial Relations Act dismantled collective bargaining, fragment unions. In the past, there was one union that unionized, that everybody should belong to, a federation of unions. Now they liberalize them, and so there are lots of competing unions. And this is a strategy of the government to fragment, to fragment all these very powerful unions. So I don't have time to go into detail. If you want to ask me, I can elaborate on them. But I want to just tell you that the reason why foreign investors practice what they do has a lot to do with the law. The laws that are set by the Zambian government. Now you would ask, why would the Zambian government set these terrible laws for their own workers? Well, it has to do with something more global. And we have to look at what happened in the 90s when the World Bank and IMF, the copper prices went downhill in the 70s. And there was this socialist government in Zambia, so it's pretty much like Greece today. So they started borrowing money, and they didn't, copper prices was so low there was not enough revenue to pay back, so they borrowed more. And the World Bank and IMF and Western donors loaned them more money on the condition that they accept SAP, which is Structural Adjustment Programs, and impose liberalization of the economy as well as politics since 1990. And what they did was to result in massive loss of jobs because state-owned enterprises have to be privatized, and informalization and deregulation of the labor market started at that point. So it was before the Chinese went to Africa, before the South Africans and all these other Brazilians, Indians bought their mines. So the argument I want to make, the first argument I want to make is primitive accumulation has been achieved by all these Western financial institutions before the Chinese and other non-Chinese capital arrived in Zambia. Now, primitive accumulation is the idea that capital, if certain investors want to expand its operation, capitalism, if it wants to expand and go from one country to other parts of the world, it will encounter barriers. What kind of barriers? Barriers that come from non-capitalist social relations, non-capitalist mode of production. For example, in the countryside, people don't have market relations to each other, they just produce for self-subsistence. Or in the case of Zambia, before the World Bank and IMF came in, it was a nationalized economy. Basically, after independence, Zambia pursued what they call humanism. And all the major industries, like Chinese industries, were nationalized, and people have permanent jobs, in a real sense of permanent. And those are not capitalist mode of production, those are not capitalist social relations. And if Chinese capitalism wanted to expand into Zambia, it has to break down that kind of relationship. It has to absorb non-capitalist labor, non-capitalist assets into its orbit. And that job, that kind of primitive accumulation, is accomplished for them, not by them, but for them by structural adjustment. So if people are arguing that the Chinese are colonialist, it's not the Chinese that are colonialist. It is actually the World Bank and IMF that have done the job that colonialists historically had to do if they want to tap into non-capitalist modes of production. Accumulation by dispossession is what David Harvey has recently rebranded this kind of process, and saying that it's not just at the beginning of capitalism that we see this kind of primitive accumulation, but is occurring all over the place. And I think in Zambia we see it very clearly. It is the World Bank and IMF and the Western donors, which are usually previous colonial power, that have cleared the ground for the Chinese to arrive. And they have privatized, they have released all these labor power and machinery and mines resources that were previously under a nationalized economy, non-capitalist economy, release them so that the Chinese could come in. And what the Chinese and other investors are doing is not colonialist, it's not, in a sense that it's not primitive accumulation, which the British were doing. What the Chinese are doing is regular accumulation of profit back to investment. They are just doing the regular job. And so the Chinese took advantage of this along with other non-Chinese foreign investors. So much I've talked is really all about what the Chinese share with other non-Chinese investors. So what is special about the Chinese? There is something very special about the Chinese, and it has to do with labor exploitation. But it is not exploitation that they inflict on Zambian workers. It is the Chinese migrant managers that they brought with from China that allows the Chinese to make extra profit above and beyond what other investors are making. And we have very quantitative kind of evidence to document this. We compare, for example, a road project. We compare the bid documents of Chinese firms, South African firms, and Zambian firms bidding for the same project. And we've been told that the Chinese always can successfully bid a project with 30% less in terms of prices. And so where does that 30% savings come from? And it comes from, we look at the bid documents, so there is a price structure, the cost structure, so you look at how much they put into materials, how much for labor, how much for other things, and then there is an item called P&G, and basically is overhead expenses for covering management, salaries, housing, all the things that you need to support your crew. And then what we realized is that the Chinese were able to save 30% and therefore outbid others, foreign investors, because they could save on expenses to these managers. Now, how do they save that 30%? Where does that saving come from? Salary. Surprisingly, these guys who are those managers that I show you, they will be there based on the site for 2 years, and during those 2 years period, they do not get paid. And that constitutes tremendous cash saving. It is the cash flow for these Chinese contractors. They don't have to pay their managers and foremen, anybody from China. They don't get paid. They will be provided with basic housing that I show you. And if you compare the housing conditions for these foremen and managers, site managers, across the South African firms, Indian firms, and the Chinese firm, and the Zambian firms, and you see a very stark difference. The South Africans will have their own private SUV, 4x4, going in and out of sight. They will have one apartment to themselves. They even have maids, some of them. The Chinese don't, of course. They live 3 to a room. They don't have vehicles, so they don't have mobility. And they work 7/24, basically, 7 days a week. And because they're on site, there's no time off. And because they don't have family, there's no family life, so there is just more work after work. And so there's no mobility, and the time is totally controlled. And worst of all, they are also casualized in the sense that they are hired by agency back in China to be sent to work for these companies, and even centrally owned, state-owned companies do that. And people who have studied agency employment in China knows that even some of the biggest enterprises, state-owned enterprises in China, they use extensively agency workers, casual workers, interns, and some of the very casualized workers in state-owned companies. So we're seeing that also in Africa. But the point is, I think the savings and the exploitation happens on these Chinese migrant bond. I call them bonded. They're not legally bonded, but the situation is really bonded labor. And these are called managers. And so this is something that is unique amongst Chinese firms we don't find in other foreign investment companies. And they are very time sensitive. And the result is that labor intensity is higher in Chinese firms. So we have Zambian workers who move from Zambian, South African firms to Chinese firms because actually some Chinese firms pay higher and they pay bonuses if you work harder. They try 1 day, 2 days, they couldn't stand the speed and the demand on their work. And so they would go back to wherever originally they work. So, so we have lots of data showing that labor intensity is higher in Chinese sites. And the reason is they always want to finish before the deadline. Now, there is some kind of cultural interpretation saying that the Chinese work harder. They always, for some strange reasons, they want to beat the deadline so that they can show that they are superior. But it's not really culture. It's really about capital velocity. And the fact that they want to finish 6 months or a year ahead of time is that so that they can free the capital and the machinery and everything else to bid for more projects so that they can make more profit faster. And capital is about, again, how fast you can reinvest into production again. And the result is everybody is complaining about how hard it is to work for Chinese bosses because there's just work ethics, they call them work ethics, or this kind of commitment to work fast. And it has to do with the kind of pressure that these companies are experiencing to accumulate faster. Now, the reason why they want to accumulate faster is because, I'm losing my, okay, sorry, because it doesn't, something is happening in my screen. Anyway, why do they have this kind of pressure to finish faster and accumulate faster? Because these companies, their headquarters, their parent companies are in China. They send these companies out to make profit because profit rate is falling in China. And they are making lots of more profits in Africa so that they can be sent back to the parent company. And the parent companies are in a very competitive market. I was told that in China, for building a hospital or a school, that kind of construction, civil construction, the profit rate in China right now is 7%. In Africa, everybody is reporting to me 14 to 20%. So that's double once you go to Africa. And in road construction, it's even higher. Road construction is more labor, capital intensive. It always brings higher revenue and profit. In China, it's about 15 to 20. In Zambia, it's 20 to 30.